I still remember the day when I found the perfect piece of land to build my dream home. It was a secluded plot on the outskirts of a small town, surrounded by dense woods and with a small river running through it. The price was almost too good to be true, and I couldn't believe my luck. But, as they say, if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. The land had been on the market for years, untouched and abandoned. When I asked the real estate agent about it, she seemed reluctant to give me details, only mentioning that the previous owners had left in a hurry. But I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories, and the idea of a quiet life in the woods was too appealing to pass up. I signed the papers that same week and began making plans to clear the land. The first few days went by without incident. I spent my mornings surveying the area, marking out where I wanted to build, and my afternoons cutting down trees and clearing brush. The peace and quiet of the place were exactly what I'd been looking for. But as the days went on, I started noticing strange things, small, insignificant at first, but they added up. It began with the animals. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but then I realized that I hadn't seen a single bird or squirrel since I started working on the land. The woods were eerily silent, and the only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, but when I turned, there was nothing there. It was unsettling, but I brushed it off as nerves. Then came the footsteps. I was working late one evening, trying to clear a particularly dense patch of trees before dark. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the ground, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching on the leaves behind me. I turned around, expecting to see an animal or maybe another person, but there was no one there. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, circling around me. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. It's just your imagination, I told myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next morning, I found footprints around my tent. Large, human-like footprints, but with claw marks at the tips of the toes. They circled my camp, just as the footsteps had the night before, and then led off into the woods. I followed them for a while, but they disappeared into the underbrush. That's when I decided it was time to hire some help. I brought in a few guys from town, promising them good pay to help me clear the land. They were reluctant at first, but the money convinced them. Things seemed to go back to normal for a while. No more footsteps, no more strange noises. But then one of the workers, a burly man named Dave, went missing. We searched the woods for hours, calling out his name, but there was no sign of him. Finally, we found his hat, lying on the ground near the riverbank. The ground was disturbed, like there had been a struggle, and there were more of those strange footprints in the mud. The other workers refused to stay after that, and I couldn't blame them. They packed up and left, and I was alone again. That night, I was woken up by a terrible sound, like a low growl, but more guttural, almost inhuman. It echoed through the woods, sending a chill down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, but the sound stopped as soon as I opened the door. I stood there, listening to the silence, my heart racing. Then I saw them, two glowing eyes staring at me from the edge of the woods. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, large, yellow, and filled with a malevolent intelligence. They watched me, unblinking, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. I slowly backed away, never taking my eyes off them, and they followed my every move. I scrambled back into my tent and locked the door, praying for morning to come. When the sun finally rose, the eyes were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained. I decided to leave that day, abandoning my dream of building a home on that cursed land. As I packed up, I found more footprints around my tent, along with deep gouges in the trees, as if something with claws had been marking its territory. I never went back to that land, and I've never told anyone what happened there until now. I don't know what it was that I encountered, but I'm certain it wasn't human, and I have no doubt that if I'd stayed, I wouldn't be here to tell the tale. The land is still there, untouched and overgrown, waiting for the next unfortunate soul who dares to disturb it.
After my harrowing experience with the first piece of land, I swore I'd never go near an abandoned property again. But a few years later, life had other plans. My job transferred me to a new city, and finding a place to live was harder than I expected. The housing market was tough, and everything in my price range was either too far from work or in terrible condition. That's when I stumbled upon an ad for a small house on the edge of town, sitting on several acres of land. The price was unbelievably low, but the pictures looked promising. I was desperate, so I decided to take a look. When I arrived, the house looked just as it had in the photos, quaint, with a rustic charm that appealed to me immediately. The land, however, was another story. It was dense with overgrowth, and the trees were so thick they blocked out most of the sunlight. The real estate agent who met me there was eager to close the deal, almost too eager. I should have seen it as a warning sign, but I convinced myself that I could handle whatever came my way. As we walked through the house, the agent explained that the previous owner had passed away a few years ago, and that the property had been sitting vacant ever since. The house was in surprisingly good shape, given how long it had been empty, and I could see myself living there. The land, on the other hand, needed work. It was clear that no one had tended to it in years. The grass was tall and wild, and the trees loomed ominously over the property, casting long shadows even in the middle of the day. Despite the eerie feeling the land gave me, I decided to go ahead with the purchase. I figured I could clear the land myself and maybe even turn it into a garden or a small farm. But as soon as the papers were signed and I moved in, strange things began to happen. It started with the garden. I had decided to clear a small patch near the back of the house where I could plant some vegetables. As I dug into the earth, I noticed something strange. Small bones like those of a small animal, buried just beneath the surface. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe a cat or a rabbit had died there, I thought. But the more I dug, the more bones I found, all clustered together in a way that made my skin crawl. I stopped digging and decided to move the garden to another spot. But the next day, when I went out to continue my work, the patch of land I had dug up was completely untouched, as if I'd never been there at all. The earth was smooth and unbroken, the bones buried once more. I stood there staring at the ground in disbelief. I knew I hadn't imagined it. I had the blisters on my hands to prove it. Over the next few weeks, the land seemed to come alive in the most unsettling ways. At night, I would hear strange noises, rustling leaves, snapping branches, and what sounded like whispers carried on the wind. I told myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Then came the lights. One evening, as I sat on the porch, I noticed small, flickering lights in the trees at the far end of the property. At first, I thought they were fireflies, but they didn't move like fireflies. They hovered in place like tiny lanterns swaying in the breeze. I watched them for a while, fascinated but also unnerved. As I continued to watch, the lights began to move closer, slowly but deliberately, as if drawn to the house. When they reached the edge of the tree line, they suddenly blinked out, leaving me in darkness. I was so startled that I nearly fell out of my chair. I waited, holding my breath, but the lights didn't return. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that night I had trouble sleeping. The next day I decided to explore the land more thoroughly. I needed to know what was out there, what was causing the strange occurrences. Armed with a machete and a flashlight, I ventured into the woods, determined to get to the bottom of things. The deeper I went, the darker it got, until I was surrounded by shadows and the sound of my own footsteps. About an hour into my exploration, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown path. It was barely visible beneath the thick underbrush, but it was definitely there. Curious, I followed it, cutting through the vines and branches that blocked my way. The path wound deeper into the woods, and the further I went, the more the air seemed to thicken with an oppressive energy. Finally, the path led me to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, decrepit well, covered in moss and surrounded by wilted flowers. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine. There was something about that well that felt wrong, as if it didn't belong there, as if it was a scar on the land itself. As I approached the well, the air around me grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light of the flashlight. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I couldn't. I had to know what was in that well. I peered over the edge and shone my flashlight into the darkness below. The light barely penetrated the gloom, revealing only the stone walls that descended into nothingness. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like the echo of a voice coming from deep within the well. "Help me!" The words were so faint I almost thought I'd imagined them. But then they came again, a desperate whisper rising from the depths. "Help me!" My blood ran cold. I stumbled back from the well, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever was down there, it wasn't human. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not stopping until I was back at the house. That night, the lights returned, but this time, they didn't stay in the trees. They came right up to the house, flickering outside my windows, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I locked all the doors and windows, but it didn't matter. The lights were inside my home now, filling every corner with their ghostly glow. I didn't sleep that night or the next. I could feel the presence of something watching me, something ancient and malevolent that had been disturbed when I dug into the earth. By the third night, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and left, abandoning the house and the land to whatever darkness lay beneath it. I never went back, and I never told anyone what happened there. I sold the house at a loss and moved to a crowded apartment in the city, far from any woods or open land. But even now, I can still hear that voice in my nightmares, calling out from the depths of the well, begging for help that I will never, ever give. After everything that happened with the first two properties, I promised myself I'd never get involved with another piece of land that seemed even remotely off. But as fate would have it, I was drawn into yet another terrifying experience, one that would prove to be the most horrifying of them all. This time, it was a remote plot of land deep in the mountains. I was there on business, looking to invest in a secluded area that was being advertised as a perfect spot for a future retreat or resort. The idea of owning a piece of untouched wilderness intrigued me, especially after the isolation and stress of the city. I convinced myself that this time would be different, that the previous experiences were flukes, products of my overactive imagination. How wrong I was. The drive to the property was long and winding, taking me through dense forests and up steep, narrow roads. The further I went, the less civilization I saw. By the time I arrived, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already beginning to dip behind the mountains. The land itself was beautiful, at least at first glance. Towering pines surrounded a large open clearing that overlooked a valley. It was peaceful, almost serene, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this place could be different. I spent the first few hours walking the property, making notes of the terrain and potential sites for development. As I ventured deeper into the woods, I noticed something odd, an old, crumbling stone wall that seemed to circle the entire perimeter of the land. It was ancient, covered in moss and vines, and barely visible in places where nature had reclaimed it. It looked like it had been there for centuries, though I had no idea who might have built it or why. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to follow the wall, tracing it around the property. The deeper into the forest I went, the darker and colder it became, even though it was still early evening. I felt a sense of unease growing in the pit of my stomach, but I pushed it aside, telling myself I was being ridiculous. After nearly an hour of walking, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. A massive iron gate embedded in the wall. It was rusted and ancient, with intricate patterns etched into the metal that looked almost like runes or symbols. The gate was slightly ajar, as if it had been left open intentionally, inviting anyone who stumbled upon it to venture inside. I stood there for a long moment, debating whether I should go through. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But something, call it curiosity or maybe sheer stupidity, pushed me forward. I stepped through the gate and into the darkness beyond. What I found on the other side defied all logic. The land beyond the gate was different, darker, more sinister. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the ground was covered in a layer of dead leaves that crunched underfoot. There was no sign of life, no birds, no insects, nothing. It was as if this place had been forgotten by time itself. As I continued deeper into this strange, twisted version of the forest, I began to hear something, a faint whispering, just at the edge of hearing. It was too quiet to make out any words, but it filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I wanted to turn back, to run as fast as I could, but my feet seemed rooted to the spot. Then out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, shadows flitting between the trees. too quick to be anything human. I spun around trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but there was nothing there. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I realized with a sickening horror that it was coming from all around me, as if the trees themselves were speaking. Panic set in, and I turned to flee. But the path I had come down was gone, swallowed by the twisted forest. I was trapped, surrounded by those dark, whispering trees with no way out. I ran anyway, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to find an escape. The shadows followed me, keeping just out of sight, but I could feel them closing in, could hear their whispers growing louder, more urgent. Finally, I broke through the trees and into another clearing, a small, circular space with a single ancient oak standing in the center. Its branches were bare, and its trunk was blackened, as if it had been struck by lightning. But what really caught my attention was what lay at its base, an old, weathered stone altar, covered in strange symbols that matched those on the gate. And there, lying on the altar, was a book, an ancient, leather-bound tome that looked like it hadn't been touched in centuries. Against my better judgment, I approached the altar, drawn by some unseen force. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. I reached out to touch the book, but the moment my fingers brushed the cover, a shock of cold shot through me, freezing me in place. Suddenly, the shadows that had been following me materialized, taking on vaguely human forms. They circled the altar, their faces hidden in darkness. But I could feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. Then, without warning, the book snapped open, its pages flipping wildly as if caught in a violent wind. The symbols on the altar began to glow with an unnatural light, and the shadows closed in, their whispers filling my mind, overwhelming me with a sense of dread unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I don't know how I managed to break free, but somehow I did. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just desperate to get away from that cursed place. The shadows followed me, their whispers turning to screams, but I didn't stop. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out beneath me. When I finally stopped, I found myself back at the iron gate, which was now sealed shut, the runes on its surface glowing faintly in the darkness. I didn't dare try to open it. Instead, I turned and fled back through the forest, not stopping until I reached my car. I left the mountain that night, abandoning any plans I had for the property. I never went back, and I never spoke of what happened there. But I can still hear the whispers in my dreams, still feel the cold grip of those shadows closing in. That land is cursed, and whatever lies within it is something far older and more dangerous than I could ever understand. By the time I found myself embroiled in the events surrounding the fourth piece of land, I was convinced that I was cursed. Every property I had encountered seemed to harbor something dark and malevolent, but this time it felt different, worse somehow. It was as though whatever evil forces had plagued me in the past were becoming stronger, more persistent. The land in question was located in a remote part of the countryside, far from any major town or city. It was a vast expanse of rolling hills and dense forests, with a long abandoned farmhouse standing at its center. The previous owner had left the property under mysterious circumstances, selling it for a fraction of its value and moving away without a word. That alone should have been a red flag, but I was desperate to find something that would break the streak of bad luck I'd been having. I convinced myself that this place was just neglected, not cursed. I arrived at the property on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was overcast, casting a gray pall over the landscape, and a chill wind blew through the trees. The farmhouse itself was in a state of disrepair, windows boarded up, paint peeling from the walls, and the roof sagging in places. Despite its dilapidated appearance, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. As I approached the house, I noticed something strange. The air around the property felt thick, almost oppressive, and the closer I got, the more I struggled to breathe. I chalked it up to nerves, forcing myself to continue toward the front door. When I finally reached it, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the rusted doorknob. A voice in the back of my mind screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed it aside and opened the door. The inside of the farmhouse was worse than the outside. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, and the air was stale and musty. But that wasn't what caught my attention. No, it was the overwhelming sense of dread that hit me like a tidal wave the moment I stepped inside. It was as though the house itself was alive, and it knew I was there. I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me, and I struggled to keep my composure. I made my way through the house, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old wood made my heart race. The house felt like a maze, with narrow hallways that twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense. Rooms that should have been next to each other seemed impossibly far apart, and more than once I found myself back at the front door without any recollection of how I got there. Eventually, I stumbled upon a staircase leading down to the basement. The door at the top was ajar, and a foul stench wafted up from the darkness below. It was a smell unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Rotting meat, damp earth, and something else. Something indescribable. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to descend the stairs as if an invisible hand was pushing me forward. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of my flashlight. The walls were lined with shelves, each one covered in strange, ritualistic objects. Animal bones, melted candles, and jars filled with unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room stood a large circular stone slab with deep grooves carved into its surface. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, and I realized with horror that it was an altar, much like the one I had seen in the cursed forest. As I approached the altar, I noticed something even more disturbing. Scattered around the room were dozens of old photographs, each one depicting a different person standing in front of the farmhouse. Their faces were all blurred, but their eyes, those were crystal clear, wide with terror, as if they had seen something unspeakable. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that many of the photos were of people who had gone missing in the area over the past few decades. I remembered reading about their disappearances, but I had never imagined they could be connected to this place. It was then that I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there. The growl grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the floor begin to vibrate beneath my feet. Panic set in, and I turned to flee, but the basement door slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping me in the darkness. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The growling was now accompanied by a chorus of whispers, voices that seemed to come from every corner of the room. They spoke in a language I didn't understand, but their tone was unmistakable, angry, hateful, and filled with malice. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me like a weight, and I struggled to stay upright. I backed away from the altar, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold on to the flashlight. As I did, the whispers grew louder, more frenzied, and I felt a cold hand brush against the back of my neck. I whipped around, but again, there was nothing there. The fear was overwhelming, suffocating, and I knew I had to get out of there before it consumed me. I sprinted toward the basement door, praying that it would open, but as I reached it, the growling stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. For a moment, I thought it was over, that whatever malevolent force was in the house had decided to let me go. But then, just as I touched the doorknob, the whispers returned, louder than ever, and the room was plunged into darkness as my flashlight flickered out. I fumbled with the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder still, until they were a cacophony of voices, each one more terrifying than the last. The walls seemed to close in on me, and I felt something cold and slimy wrap around my ankle, pulling me away from the door. I screamed, kicking at whatever had hold of me, but it was no use. The force dragged me across the floor, toward the altar, and I knew with sickening certainty that I was going to die in that basement. But just as I was about to give in to the darkness, the door flew open, flooding the room with light. The grip on my ankle vanished, and I scrambled to my feet, bolting up the stairs without looking back. I didn't stop running until I was outside, gasping for breath and shaking uncontrollably. The farmhouse loomed behind me, dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I had felt the presence in that basement, and it was something far older and more powerful than I could ever comprehend. I left the property that day, vowing never to return. Whatever lurked in that farmhouse wasn't something that could be reasoned with or understood. It was pure malevolent evil, and I knew that if I had stayed even a moment longer, it would have claimed me just as it had claimed all those others. To this day, I still have nightmares about that place, about the whispers and the cold, slimy hand that tried to drag me to my death. I've since given up on buying land altogether, but I know that no matter how far I run, the darkness will always be there, waiting, watching, and biding its time until it can claim me for good.